What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Fantasy Flex Podcast. The NFL regular season is done. We had a wild 18-week roller coaster, and today we are very excited to take a look back on the highs and lows of another fantasy season with longtime friend of the podcast, NFL insider for ESPN and co-host of the Fantasy Focus Football Podcast, Field Yates. Field, what's going on?
How are you guys? Always good to be back on with you and a lot to talk about. During the preseason, we have lots to talk about as well, but everything is projecting. Now we get to reflect a little bit and figure out where we went right, where we went wrong, because believe it or not, we did have a couple of things that we didn't quite size up accurately during the preseason, and certainly lots to digest and some lessons learned along the way.
Yes, sir. So let's jump right into it. Let's go position by position here. Okay. And Field, I'll start with you, and Sean, feel free to chime in as well. But let's start with quarterback. Who were your biggest surprises or breakouts at the QB position, Field?
So I would start by saying that I think this year was one of the duller years for quarterbacks in recent memory. As we have long talked about, there's this great depth at quarterback, right? You could wait until the 14th round and land yourself a solid Kirk Cousins level quarterback who was going to be within 4.5 points per game of the highest scoring quarterback, or at least somewhere in that neighborhood. This year, we found that such was not the case. As far as season-long breakouts go, there really was just one who I think if you picked him up after week one, you felt was like above the proverbial Mendoza line of starting quarterback level in fantasy, and that was Geno Smith. He ends up as quarterback 5 for the season, which is still crazy for me to think, but he was well behind the Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allens of the world on a points per game basis, fewer than 18 points per game for Geno. So a solid season, no doubt, but not necessarily an all-star fantasy season. And then Justin Fields, who when he was great was like almost all-time great, but it took a while for us to get there. And obviously he got hurt on multiple occasions down the stretch where you were concerned about him missing time. So Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence come to mind as like the biggest breakouts. Justin Fields and Geno Smith come to mind as the biggest breakouts of this year, Chris, but in very different shapes and forms, right? Justin he may have been the MVP of your team, even if he only gave you 8 starts. Geno Smith was probably not the reason why you won your league. If you won with Geno Smith, it was that you drafted wisely around Geno and made the pivot from a Brady or a Wilson or a Stafford or a Rodgers early on in the year to Geno, and that was the formula to success.
Yeah, absolutely. Geno, it was kind of a consistent thing that there wasn't a huge spike games that you got from Justin Fields. Sean, anybody to add there?
No, I'm in line with that. Obviously, the biggest surprise is Geno because, his ADP was QB 35. We didn't really know if he was going to start beyond week one. If you remember, we thought Drew Lock might be making a start. So it has to be Geno all the way, finishes a QB 5. And like Field mentioned, he was a great backup option. Like leagues where I had Trey Lance, I ended up picking up Geno Smith, and he did help me win a championship in one of those leagues. So he was a big surprise and just a huge help for teams that picked him up early on.
All right, Field, let's pivot to bust. Guys that completely just blew yours, disappointed. What do you got?
Yeah, I think there is one that stands above the rest, which is interesting when you think about the years of Russell Wilson and Tom Brady and Matthew Stafford, who got hurt, and even Lamar Jackson, who prior to his injury, which was forever ago, Lamar was red hot to the first 3 games of the season and then just tapered off dramatically. But to me, the most obvious bust is Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers, who ends up playing all 17 games this season and doesn't hit 20 fantasy points in a single game. And think about some of the soft spots that Rodgers had in the fantasy playoffs where you're thinking to yourself, all right, this could be the week in which Aaron Rodgers turns it on. If you even go back to week 13, they play in Chicago against the Bears, under 14 fantasy points. They go into their late bye. They draw the Rams on the other side of it. That's Monday Night Football, which the Rams were a different defense by that point. 10.86 fantasy points. Christmas Day at the Dolphins. Everybody can throw on the Dolphins, right? 13.32 fantasy points. Well, at least you get the Vikings in week 17. 16.56 fantasy points against the Vikings. And by the way, that was because he had a 2-yard rushing touchdown. And then the Lions in week 18, which, if you did play all the way until week 18 this season, you got 11.2 fantasy points. Rodgers never hitting 20 fantasy points was bad enough, but also letting you down such a critical moment late in the year when people are having to make their pivots, whether it was from a guy who got hurt or Justin Fields being unavailable late in the season, Lamar Jackson being unavailable late in the season, quarterbacks just not being good for the entire season. To me, it feels like Rodgers is the bust of the quarterback class.
So here's my question. Are we giving Tom Brady a pass because he put up like the 36 in the championship? Or because I feel like he was kind of right there in terms of, one of those GOATs who people drafted just feeling like he was going to have a high floor, and the guy just really no-shows for most of the season.
Yeah, that's a very fair. I mean, like Brady definitely is in the case, or is in the running. It's weird to think about Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers being in the running for an award that has a negative connotation. Because you look at the full season points per game gap, and it's nearly 2 fantasy points, 16 to 14.1. But a lot of that obviously is attributable to that breakout game for Brady in week 17. Yes, I would agree that Brady is right there in the mix as well. I just feel like anecdotally, there were more soft spots for Rodgers that we kept pointing to as the potential breakout game, and they just never occurred. And for those reasons, I think Aaron Rodgers takes the slight edge, but they've got company too, right? I mean, Russ does not deserve a pass given the fact that his breakout games came to the final 2 weeks of the season. Even Derek Carr was a trendy sleeper pick. I was certainly in on Derek Carr. He had less than 15 fantasy points per game this year. There were a lot of quarterbacks that let you down, which made the rise of Justin Fields that much more valuable this season.
Yeah, and a kind of honorable mention I'll throw out there just before we move on. Justin Herbert didn't really have a ton of monster games either. I mean, he was middle of the pack, 15th in points per game scoring, but certainly expected more from him as well.
Totally. And obviously, and I tell people this all the time, is that there is value and there's also like some real danger in looking at end of season numbers, right? Because end of the season, you're going to sit there and say, wow, Justin Herbert, 25 passing touchdowns. Like that's good. Right. And by the way, that's like, I think it was like 7th in the NFL. Like that's a pretty reasonable amount, right? Weeks 13 through 16, when you needed Justin Herbert in a big way, he had a total of 2 touchdown passes. He had 2 games with 8.72 or fewer fantasy points, including in week 16, semifinal week, where he had 5.5 against the Colts on Monday night. So not all fantasy points are created equally. And I feel like Herbert's a good example of that.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into running backs. Who surprised you this year at running back field?
Yeah, so I think there are different tiers to running backs just because it's a matter of where you were drafted. I think that Josh Jacobs is in that tier of guys that broke out and was amongst the very best that I would not. We all knew about Josh Jacobs. Like I believe I have to go check this. I think I had him at RB 18 coming into the season, which was probably in line with industry average. And he finishes obviously the 3rd highest score in running back on a points per game and total basis for this year. So Josh Jacobs getting the volume that he did and just executing basically and finishing all of his goal line opportunities, that certainly paid off. You go down to the next tier, guys that we knew had talent, but were lodged into a potential workflow or potential 2-man backfield. Ramondre Stevenson and Tony Pollard, right? Both those guys. Like Ramondre impressed as a rookie. Tony Pollard kind of always impressed when he got opportunities. They were both awesome this year, different ways. Pollard still continued to split work with Zeke, who kept scoring all the touchdowns, but Tony Pollard was so explosive, had so many big plays, both in the passing game and as a runner as well. And then Stevenson, we always thought like, hey, a Bill Belichick offense is never going to have just one guy, especially with Damian Harris still in the fold. Well, between injuries to Damian Harris and then just the play of Ramondre Stevenson, kind of the only thing that made the Patriots worth watching on offense this year, he had a breakout season as well. Then you get down to like lower tiers of guys who I'm not so sure that it was like ever going to be sustainable past this season, but they made it through this entire year, right? Like Jamal Williams, like if you had him on your team, you play in non-PPR formats, especially like leading the NFL in rushing touchdowns is not nothing, even if there were weeks in which you were fearful of 15 carries for 47 yards and 0 targets and 0 touchdowns and an absolute dud in PPR scoring.
Yeah, I mean, Jamal Williams was going to be the guy that I mentioned. I mean, Sean, any thoughts on who is it for you? Because it's certainly Williams for me, even though I was kind of high on him coming into the year. I had no idea it was going to be 17 rushing touchdowns and 1,000 yards.
Those leader carries, you called that for sure. But my breakout and surprise candidate was Ramondre Stevenson as well. He emerged as a workhorse back pretty early in the season. If you remember, the first game Damian Harris missed, he went all the way up to number 1 in my rankings, and he finished number 1 that week. So it just goes to show his massive upside when he's the workhorse back. And eventually, once Damian Harris did return, it didn't even matter. Stevenson was still a top 10 back. I know Belichick loves him. So heading into next season, I think he's going to be a surefire top 5, top 10 back. So he was by far my favorite breakout this year.
All right, let's go to busts. Always a lot of busts at the running back position field. So get us started.
Right? Yeah. All right. So I don't want to be unfair to him because he was good for a stretch, but I think everybody is going to point to Jonathan Taylor first because basically the one thing you count on for Jonathan Taylor beyond the fact that he was very talented was his durability, and that reared itself. And it's going to make me rethink how I talk about running backs with 0 injuries in their rearview mirror going forward, right? Because this is 2 out of 3 years where one of the reasons why you drafted a guy as a consensus 1.01 was he'd never missed time before. Christian McCaffrey, this was the same argument a few years ago. But Jonathan Taylor probably feels like the player that leads the way in terms of fantasy busts amongst running backs. And then number 2 is maybe a debate. Because for, 75% of the season, he was a colossal bust. And then for the final 5 weeks, he was terrific. And that's Cam Akers. So I don't know if I feel like I got vengeance because Cam Akers was awesome down the stretch, or if I just totally whiffed on this one. But his last 5 games were truly absurd, right? Maybe it was 6 games, but he went down the stretch and had back-to-back 100-plus yard finishes in his final 3 games. Did not have a ton of passing game involvement, but he held off Kyron Williams, who we thought could be a useful pass catcher for the Rams. Obviously, Darrell Henderson is no longer there. And I think the big takeaway for Cam Akers with me for this year is that, all right, I whiffed. I screwed up. I didn't think he would ever get to the point where he was going to potentially be cut or traded by the Rams. But I now think going forward that if you look at this offense in future years, and there's so much that's uncertain at the time of this conversation, but let's just imagine a world where Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp are back and they make sort of reasonable investments going forward. Like Cam Akers could be the guy next year in LA, and I could see him as a top 25 back going into 2023.
Yeah, Akers, I think, I would consider him a bust because you drafted him probably second, third round, and he didn't get he had 1 double-digit fantasy game before week 13. So, I mean, the person who drafted him was not the person probably even benefiting from his breakout down the stretch.
Yeah, he was a bust for the person who drafted him and a sleeper/steal for the person that grabbed him off waivers.
Anyone else?
Yeah, this one's unfair, but J.K. Dobbins, just because he obviously was hurt, but that there were some who were all in on J.K. Dobbins. The 2 things that were concerning for me coming into the season was obviously the knee, and J.K. was very outspoken on Twitter about how he was going to be back. He wasn't going to go on PMP. He ended up obviously missing some time early in the season. But the other red flag, and this is year 5 for Lamar Jackson, so basically 4.5 years of starting, is that whether it's because of the system, whether it's because of Lamar's preference or what, he doesn't throw the ball to running backs. He doesn't do it. Like there's been 1 running back that has made an impact as a receiving back for the Ravens over the past 5 years. And much of that production came when Joe Flacco was still a starter, and that was 5 full seasons ago. So I think that was Buck Allen, by the way, Javorius Buck Allen, USC legend. So it's been a long time since they had 50 receptions for the Ravens, and it just puts a dramatic cap on how good that player can be. Even if he's averaging 7 yards per carry, which is where J.K. Dobbins was down the stretch, it doesn't matter, right? He could have 15 carries for 56 yards. If he gets 1 target, he is extremely unlikely to be a top 25 finisher that week.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's, running back target rate is inversely correlated with the quarterback scramble rate. It just seems like the quarterbacks who scramble. I mean, look at Hurts. Miles Sanders doesn't get a ton of love in the pass game. Pretty much only Saquon because he's Saquon, and they have to feed him the ball in New York. And then
to your point, though, right? Who's the most statuesque quarterback in the NFL? Tom Brady. And which 2 running backs down the stretch were both getting 6 targets a game? Rashad White and Leonard Fournette.
Yeah. Sean, any other busts?
Yeah, this one's personal for me because he's a back I target every year, and that's got to be Kareem Hunt. As you know, I love targeting running backs in that range. Stevenson, Tony Pollard, Hunt,
Dillon, AJ Dillon. Yeah.
AJ Dillon was fine this year, but yeah, he was kind of a bust as well. But I love backs in that range because they're going to offer weekly, RB3 flex value, but have top 5 upside if the starting running back were ever in this time. So, Nick Chubb was healthy all season. He played all 17 games. So we didn't get that injury upside game from Hunt. But even when Chubb was healthy, Hunt's role was really diminished this year. You couldn't really trust him at all in your lineup. So that's why, he probably didn't kill you based on his draft capital, but you did miss out on Pollard, Stevenson, Miles Sanders, Kenneth Walker, Damian Pierce in that range. So it was a bit of an opportunity cost taking him in the mid round. So, I take him every year, but this might be the last year I target him there. It's Kareem Hunt.
It could have been worse. It could have been Melvin Gordon.
That's true.
True.
All right, wide receivers, Field. Who you got for your breakouts?
This one's interesting because it's obviously the deepest position in fantasy, and again, you kind of have to look at it through tiers. I don't know that I can call Amon-Ra St. Brown a breakout player, but I thought I was optimistic on Amon-Ra coming into the season, and I probably wasn't optimistic enough because there was a stretch there where he was consistently falling in like the 6 to 10 range in my weekly rankings, and he put to bed any concerns that his production in 2021 was largely, or at least partially, due to the fact that everybody was hurt in Detroit at that time, and they were terrible on defense, and they had to throw it. Just a casual 106 catch season this year. He's one that comes to mind. I think both Jaguars wide receivers come to mind. Christian Kirk, who had the first 1,000-yard receiving season in his career. He had a big touchdown outbreak as well, or breakout, I should say. And then Zay Jones, who, the money told you they were optimistic on those guys, and he was tremendous this year for the Jaguars. Zay Jones was, and he was a great value pick based off where he was going. And while Zay Jones was not the reason why you won your league, if he was the first wide receiver on your bench, you were sitting pretty during bye weeks and obviously got some big boom weeks down the stretch.
Yeah, Zay Jones is the guy who really stands out to me because I remember this guy, he was a guy that was kind of ridiculed early in his career. I mean, he was one of the least efficient wide receivers in the league, and he kind of bounced around, and then he started to put it together last year, but then changed teams again. You're like, all right, whatever. Is that going to be a flash in the pan? And then next thing you know, he's a top 30 wide receiver in fantasy. Totally. Yeah. So, Zay Jones. Sean, I know you like Zay. Is he kind of your biggest surprise or?
He's obviously one of the biggest surprises. So is Christian Kirk. I mean, we knew that he had upside as the Jaguars' number one wide receiver, but he was a borderline top 10 wide receiver this year. So he was a surprise for me. I think the breakout guy was Garrett Wilson, though, for me, because, I thought for sure he was going to end up at Atlanta. So I was surprised that the Falcons took Drake London, but I didn't like the landing spot because the Jets already had, Corey Davis, Elijah Moore, who we thought was really good. But Garrett Wilson finished wide receiver 19 as a rookie, despite just a very volatile QB situation. So he's only going to get better. The situation around him will only get better. So I'm very excited to see him heading into next season.
One other name I'll throw out. I mean, his point per game production wasn't great, but he did finish in the top 40. Curtis Samuel. I don't think anybody saw him kind of sneak it in there, but
waves, right?
There he was, wide receiver 31 to finish the year.
It was kind of waves for Curtis Samuel too, right? Because like the first, I want to say 3 weeks, he was awesome. Like, remember the entire passing offense for the Commanders was like ridiculous out of the gates.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking for Curtis Samuel, I was like, as long as they keep doing what they've been doing, this should persist because it wasn't just target volume. He was getting carries and you were like, I remember this guy who in the last half of his final season in Carolina was being used really creatively. It's why he earned that big contract with the Commanders. Kind of had some shades of his Ohio State utilization as well. And that kind of tapered off. And then the quarterback change took place. And I know that sometimes these things get a little bit overblown, but it certainly seemed like the Taylor Heineke and Terry McLaurin connection / chemistry was real enough that it seemed to have an impact on McLaurin going in the right direction and others going in the wrong direction in that offense.
All right, let's pivot to bust because I can think of so many off the top of my head at wide receiver. So we got to get through a bunch of these guys. So start us off, Field. Who comes to mind first for wide receiver bust?
Mike Evans, and he got totally augured by that late season game. But look at where he was in the weeks prior to that, right? So Mike Evans, I'm going to read you the game log from weeks 9 through week 16. Fantasy points per game. 9.0, 10.4, 5.1, 9.9, 8.4, 13.3, 5.9. He went a stretch from week 4 to week 17 without scoring a touchdown. This is Mike Evans, who in the 3 seasons prior to this year had more receiving touchdowns than any player in the NFL. You were drafting Mike Evans, understanding he does have his occasional bust week, right? But it's always offset by the massive breakout weeks. And he had just 2 games over 20 fantasy points this season. Now, they were 2 massive games, 30.3 in one week and 48.7 in the other. But the reality is that there was a 6 or 7 week stretch where you reluctantly played Mike Evans or you regrettably played Mike Evans. So he's the bust for me.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Evans, and then of course, I mean, he bails people out. So I mean, at least he did that in the championship week with the 3 touchdown game. But I mean, I don't even know how many people were starting him by then. But I mean, there's so many other guys that come to mind. I mean,
there's a ton.
Elijah Moore, Darnell Mooney.
Wait, Elijah Moore, who's he? Does he play?
Exactly.
Right. Like, I mean, there were some guys that were expected to kind of be their team's, go-to guy. And just completely, I mean, I think Elijah Moore probably is at the top of my list just because, even with Garrett Wilson breaking out, like for Elijah Moore to just disappear, it was like, wow.
Yeah. I mean, Deontay Johnson was disappointing, right? Just 0 touchdowns scored, which is obviously it's tough to do when you have 86 catches. It's never been done before. DJ Moore got hot down the stretch, but he was quiet for a long time too. And as we know with these wide receivers, it's not like these guys have changed in terms of who they are physical skill set wise, right? A lot of it is just the circumstances or the quarterback or the offense changes. And that seemed to really undo a ton of wide receivers this year. I
got another name before we move on.
All right.
Allen Robinson.
Thank you. That's what I was going to say.
I know.
Man. Because the hype, it just kept growing and growing. And next thing you know, he's like a top 30 wide receiver, an ADP.
We couldn't figure out what to do. We got our brains got turned into a pretzel with that one. Dumb.
I mean, yeah. There was just a bunch of landmines, and like you could have drafted like Mooney, Moore, Robinson, like back to back. Cortland Sutton was in there, like just so many busts in that like low end or high end wide receiver 3, I guess you call it.
Yep.
But yeah. All right. Let's go to tight end, and
it's interesting here, right?
Yeah, who surprised you at tight end, Phil?
Oh man, well, so let's talk positively first. I'll give you a couple of names here, and for tight ends, you really have to be much more focused in on like stretches of time as opposed to the full season. But the 2 that come to mind for me, TJ Hawkinson, who was good for 2 teams this year, had the massive game early on in the season for the Lions. And then I think he had a bagel like the following week. I think it was literally like 37 points one week and then 0 the next. Let me check that. Okay. 39.9 followed up by 1.6. He got Belichicked in week 5 by the Patriots, who held him to just 1 catch after that monster game against Seattle. But played really well for the Vikings, played well in the playoffs, had the big game in the semifinal week where he had those 2 touchdowns and the 13 catches. And then Evan Ingram obviously was very good as well for the Jaguars as the season wore on. It wasn't quite like fire out of the gates with a massive, massive season for Evan Ingram, but he kind of hit his stride in the last third or so of the season and was a useful, reliable, could count on you tight end. And then other guys, it's like certain stretches. Right? Dalton Schultz was good when Dak Prescott played. Cole Kmet had some moments as well. But I think the story of tight end is probably more disappointment than it is celebrating guys this year.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the top 10, and I'm looking like Tyler Higbee's number 6. And I mean, he had like a couple of weeks here and there. Kmet, same thing. Like he didn't really do anything till the second half. Schultz was up and down. Yeah.
Taysom Hill was tight end 8. Taysom Hill, who had the 1 week, what was it, like he had 3 rushing touchdowns. It was like the first player ever with like 3 rushing touchdowns as a quarterback. It was some ridiculous, like broke some sort of record. And that also accounted for like 20% of his production. But it just is a reminder of how thin and desperate the position can get in a hurry. And talented guys, right? Like Hayden Hurst, talented player, 105.4 fantasy points for the season. Austin Hooper, Chigakonkwo, I'm looking at some of the names in that range. Mike Gesicki, Hunter Henry, like these guys all could play. It's just that volume or crowded skill group rooms have prevented them from making a major impact.
Yeah, I think the answer is, the surprises were just Saints tight ends like Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill, right? I mean, Sean, I feel like every week I was like, we got to fade Juwan Johnson. He's not going to keep catching touchdowns. And he just kept catching touchdowns.
Yeah, exactly. He's a touchdown dependent tight end that constantly scored touchdowns. Exactly.
Well, damn it. All right, let's go to bust. And I mean, it feels like a lot of these guys, even like I'm looking at a top 5 guy who I feel like was a bust field, but curious to your thoughts on.
Yeah, the answer is Mark Andrews.
Yeah.
And I hate to say that for Mark because it wasn't like he was terrible relative to the position. He had nearly 850 receiving yards. He had 73 catches this year. There were plenty of spirited debates about whether Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews should be tight end 1 coming into the season. Kelce only had 125.8 more points over the course of the year. So I think we know which way that one should have leaned towards. It's also fair to point out that Mark Andrews played in a much different offense. Lamar Jackson was hurt for a good chunk of it. They aren't nearly as inclined to throw the football as Kansas City is. But the problem is that you paid a real premium on Mark Andrews. It was going at early second round in some leagues. Heck, people were willing to take him in a large league, a 16-team league. People were willing to take the positional edge early and take him 16th overall. And for the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season, it looked like you had made the exact right call. Part of it was when Lamar was going crazy, but even when Lamar cooled off a little bit, he was at 22.9 fantasy points or more in 4 of his first 6 games. 22.9. Then you go down the stretch and he had a 4-week stretch where he had less than 10 fantasy points in each of those 4 games. So not exactly a great year for Mark Andrews by the standard he set for himself.
Yeah, and that just shows you how, the state of the position when he still finished top 5 after all that. All right, let's get some postseason predictions on the board here. Obviously most fantasy leagues are wrapped up now, but tons of our listeners, they're still going to play DFS, join playoff leagues, all that good stuff. So looking at the playoff landscape field, who are some players you see breaking out for a huge fantasy performance in the wild card weekend or just, throughout the postseason?
Well, by the way, and you guys are, I'm sure, aware of this format, but it's a fun thing for those that maybe are looking to have some involvement in the fantasy playoffs, but don't have the right format. This is something fun that a group of colleagues and friends do that I'm a part of at ESPN. And you build a 16-team roster. Our format is 3 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 4 receivers, 3 flex, 1 tight end, 2 defenses. And you must pick 1 player from each of the 14 teams. And then you have 2 players from 2 teams. So if you wanted to take Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs, you could. If you wanted to take Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, you could. But you'd have to then just pick 1 player from any of the remaining 12 other teams. So it's a fun way. And there's obviously strategy involved, right? So this week, my strategy is going to be probably the same every single time I do this. Is I view the Bills as a very decided favorite over the Dolphins. Thus I will sort of punt my Dolphins pick, right? So I'll pick Dolphins defense, right? I'd rather not waste a wide receiver spot on Tyreek Hill, who might get you 20 this week, right? But he's gone after this week. So as far as defenses to attack or players to look at for DFS, George Kittle's probably the most popular name you'll hear going up to this week because they play the Seahawks. And I know the Cardinals forever have been the defense that allowed the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. The Seahawks overtook them by the end of the season. George Kittle had a great game against them late in the season. Kittle seems to be one of the chalkiest DFS plays that is worth the price that you are likely getting him for, which will be, I'm imagining on most sites, the most expensive tight end for the wild card round, with Travis Kelce unavailable because he's on the bye, and then obviously Mark Andrews playing with somebody not named Lamar Jackson.
Yeah, Kittle is, he balled out against the Seahawks in that. What was it? He got 2 touchdowns in that last game. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he went crazy. Anyone else, Phil?
Other players to consider for this week. Basically, I'm avoiding the entire Dolphins passing game, which makes so you have some obvious pivots here. I'm actually pulling up a schedule right now to remind myself of which day and which thing is happening. But I think the Jaguars and Chargers game could be higher scoring than maybe the current forecast is. So there's going to be one of those Jaguars wide receivers that kind of goes off. and I need to think longer and harder about who I want to pick amongst those Jaguars wide receivers before I put my foot down definitively. How about you guys? I'm sort of like stumping myself on a Jaguars wide receiver. So buy me some time here. So somebody that comes to mind.
Sean, I know you got some guys.
Sean, you got someone.
Yeah. So for the entire playoffs,
Okay.
I'm going with Gabe Davis because he's struggled down the stretch, and I think some of that had to do with Josh Allen's elbow injury in Week 9. I think Josh Allen played that down a bit, but it was certainly impacting his decision making not to throw it downfield as much as he typically does. But last week, he had that arm strength that throw to Diggs was amazing. So, and as we were talking about before we went on, Allen's scrambling a bit less, so we could just see more pass attempts to go around. But similar to last year in the playoffs, I think Gabe Davis is going to have some strong performances. And then for this weekend specifically, I would have to go with Cade Otton at tight end. So he's a rookie tight end.
Much deeper than I am.
Oh, yeah, this is a DFS play for sure. But he's, been fairly quiet of late. And last week they bubble wrapped him. He only ran around on 24% of dropbacks, but they've been treating him like the true number one tight end in that offense for a couple months now. So I expect him to run around on 85% of Tom Brady's dropbacks this week. And, rookie tight ends typically take a while to adjust to the position in the NFL. So he's only going to get better. Could break out with a big game this weekend.
I like it. Yeah, Daniel Jones also won again for this weekend that I think is compelling, which this is just like, I'm playing, these are all like, anybody out there who's going to be playing in a tournament, like avoid these picks because they're going to be unanimously rostered, I would think. But as we know, Daniel Jones in the one game against the Giants, against the Vikings earlier this year, just totally carved them up defense. That pass defense, as we know, is bad as it could possibly be. That to me is like, is it too obvious of an upset pick, the Giants over the Vikings this weekend? It just feels like if everybody's going to be on one upset pick, it's the Giants over the Vikings, right?
I mean, this Viking team is bottom 5 in DVOA. It's not a great team, that defense is just not good. So they could, every game they've won, it's been like one possession pretty much. So yeah,
it's absurd. Like, and the thing is that like, it's going to go one of two ways because, and I don't listen, every fan base has fans that are like fired up positively or negatively. And like, they either bother you beyond word, or you're just like, you have to kind of accept it. Like every fan base has fans that maybe are like a little bit too passionate for their own good. Right. But like on Sunday, you're either going to have one cross section of football fans, I'll just say fans in general, who are going to be saying, I told you so. Like, this team stunk. They stunk all year. And it finally, when it came to a game that mattered the most, they were finally exposed. Or Vikings fans are going to say, keep doubting us, 13-4, now 14-4, like keep counting us out. That's what you guys have been doing all year. I do believe, though, if the Vikings do manage to get past the Giants this upcoming weekend, that the clock strikes midnight when they play the San Francisco 49ers in round 2 of the playoffs.
Absolutely. I mean, this team, every time they've been in one of those situations too, where it's like they were underdogs against the Lions and their fans are like, yo, hey, what's going on here? They got blown out against the Cowboys, blown out. Packers,
and that was the
blown
one
out.
Cowboys were the one where you're like, wait, what? Like coming off of the Bills win and they're home to the Cowboys and you're like, no. Like, when are they going to respect them? At the time they were 8-1. And then it was like, oh, they lost 40-3. Good call. This team is not who we thought they were.
Yeah. All right, let's wrap it up here, Field. This was great. What are you up to once the season ends? I know you've been just grinding all season. So what do you usually get into, once it ends?
Well, this is fun. So a week from now, the First Draft podcast, for anybody who loves the NFL draft, will be back. It's myself and I'm trying to think of like who's the least important third member of a band in the history of music, because that's me in this case. I've got myself with Todd McShay and Mel Kiper Jr., who are the preeminent voices in draft coverage, regardless of network. So I basically play point guard. They might even point guard. I just sort of sit there and stand in between them and get them from one topic to the next. But I can't wait for it. The two of them have so much passion for what they do. First draft starts up next Wednesday. So January 18th, we'll be going live on YouTube, plus the podcast form. Then Fantasy Focus is going to keep going this offseason once a week. And like, we don't know what we're going to talk about yet. Like we will talk about fantasy football, but we don't know if it's going to be, is it all looking backwards? Is it all looking forwards? It's probably going to be some of both, right? Like the 5 things we wish we had done differently this past year, the 5 things we're going to do differently next year. But the Fantasy Focus will have a bigger presence than usual this offseason, which is exciting.
Awesome, man. This is really great, Field. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure as always. And before we let you go, tell our listeners about your friends over at Sling TV.
Yeah, if you're looking for the best, most affordable way to watch as much football as humanly possible, who do we decide was the best overall value in fantasy this year? Like, are we going to go with, like, is it Geno Smith? If you're looking for the Geno Smith or the Josh Jacobs of ways to watch football, it will be Sling TV. I spent my Sundays watching Red Zone with Sling, which I'm sure many people who are listening to this podcast love Red Zone as well. It's a great way to do so. You can watch your local team as well. But I found that Sling is the perfect marriage of convenience and exactly what I want. I can kind of cater it to my needs and my desires, and a little easier to scroll through like a smaller portfolio of channels that is much more in line with what I want to be watching anyway. So I've appreciated my partnership with Sling for many years. And if you're either thinking about a change of service or somebody who is currently relying exclusively on the internet for all of your digital media needs, Sling will be a great way to get back into the game.
Awesome. And just tell everybody where they can find you before we get out of here, just in case they don't know.
If you're looking at Twitter, I try to funnel most stuff through Twitter. So Field Yates, which is a very innovative name, Field Yates on Twitter. That's as simple as it gets for me.
There you go. Field Yates on Twitter. You can follow Sean at @_oddsmaker. You can follow me at Chris Raybon, and be sure to check out actionnetwork.com for all of our fantasy football projections, content, and betting content as well. Until next time, let's get this money.